today on. We'll begin our training now on supplementary services and supports. This training is being provided to you through Family Connection, which is South Carolina's Parent Training and Information Center, which provides parent special education training and assistance to families of children with disabilities, as it's funded through IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So our objectives today include participants will identify the types of supplementary aids and services available. We'll identify specific accommodations, modifications, services, and aids to match the specific needs of students, and identify and define assistive technology supports for students with disabilities. And then we'll also share a list of available resources. A couple just business items as we get moving into the training. The chat box is always open. We'll be monitoring chat. If we have a moment to take a break in the middle, we'll kind of answer those questions as we go, or at the end, I'll stop before we take our post-training poll, go through all of those questions to the best of my ability. If there are some things that are kind of topical that look like they would be more appropriate for a Family Connection contact you, we could certainly set that up. We'll have information for you to be able to contact Family Connection as well. So we'll answer what we can today, of course, keeping everything general, nothing particular with names of specific students or any identifying information today. Thank you so much. All right, so let's get moving. We're going to talk about supplementary aids and services as the pathway to inclusive practice, because they allow the student to be involved and make progress in the general curriculum, to participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities, and then also be educated and participate with all children, not just those students with disabilities. So it's really access to that general curriculum. In the Code of Federal Regulations citation here at the bottom and within our text, there's a specific definition in context for the discussion of supplementary aids and services in IDEA. So I will, for the purpose of that language, building a common understanding, let's read through that one together. Supplementary aids and services means aids, services, and other supports that are provided in regular education classes, other education-related settings, and in extracurricular and non-academic settings to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate in accordance with these sections. So there is, a tie and a basis for our training today directly with the language in IDEA. And the requirements for supplementary aids and services indicate that they must be based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practical, and they must be provided directly to the child or on behalf of the child. So there is an indirect feature to them at certain times. Supplementary aids and services can be either provided to the student, or the aids can support the student. And the example here is sort of a device that they could carry around as a communication board or communication device. So where are the supplementary aids and services provided? Well, you guessed it, they're provided in a lot of different settings. As we suggested in some of our pre-poll questions there, they can be provided in the regular education classroom, in other education-related settings, in extracurricular settings, in non-academic settings as well. Their purpose of supplementary aids and services is, again, to enable students with disabilities to participate with their peers, regardless of whatever the uniqueness of their specific disability might be that causes learning needs. And it also removes barriers to learning that are a result of their disability. So it's important to keep those things in mind, because we have to consider them kind of, using this visual diagram here. If you're focusing on this yellow arrow that moves from a continuum of least intrusive to most intrusive, you see we kind of move along that continuum of more generalized accommodations or supplementary services within the general curriculum, up towards more intrusive modifications to the general curriculum, And then to what we typically think of as, goal-driven IEP services is called specially designed instruction. And then related services, maximize special education services. So those are those things like speech language, occupational therapy, or physical therapy in many circumstances. So remember this arrow because it gives us a good idea of how to approach selection and consideration and implementation of these sorts of supplementary aids and supports. Least intrusive, so doing the least first, and then when there's a need, an assessed need, you're moving up towards more intrusive as you go from the bottom here with accommodations all the way up to related services and specially designed instruction. Okay. So an important reminder to always consider least restrictive environment, and the supplementary aids and services should be considered and used before we move a student into a more restrictive environment. So increasing more restrictive means you're increasing the level of support or increasing the level of change to what a typical educational program would look like. Maintaining least restrictive environment should be part of all of our decisions. So let's talk about the types of supplementary aids and services. First, we'll talk about accommodations. And just a note, you will have accessible to you all of the slides, and there's a variety of handouts if you haven't already accessed those. But some of these sources that we've gotten material from for the presentation today are cited at the bottoms of the slides and again at the end of the presentation. So you're welcome to delve a little deeper if you have some burning questions or special interests. So accommodations are a change to instructional or testing procedures or materials, and they allow a student to fully access the information so that they can demonstrate their knowledge. So with accommodations, we're thinking kind of mild ways to adjust that do not change expectations for learning. They don't reduce the requirements of a task. They don't change what the student is required to learn, the content, but they meet the student's unique needs. Okay, so just like we'll kind of demonstrate later in a slide, there's not a menu that every student gets to choose from or every IEP team choose from. It always has to be unique and individualized, the selection. So there are 4 types of accommodations. Accommodations that adjust presentation, so how that material is presented to the student, the setting, response, and then time and scheduling. So we'll talk through those and give some examples. So we talked a little bit about accommodations, which you saw on our slide with the yellow arrow continuum. Modifications are another feature within special education programming. Modifications actually change. So where accommodations do not change, modifications do change. Instruction or curriculum, you are altering the content of what the instruction is that the student performs, and you do not change the expectations for learning. Or you do change the expectations for learning and reduce the requirements of the task. So on that continuum, accommodations are milder, modifications are moving up to a more significant change. So examples, assigning different assignments, different reading material, using lower level texts that contain the same subject matter. So it's more simply presented to the student, more closer to their instructional level. Testing on a subset of the covered content, so reducing the amount or answering different test questions. Next, we'll talk about aids and services and how they work. And those could be, those could be people, things, or training. So it's not always a device, it's not always a person, it's not always either of those. Sometimes it's the training, but often all 3 are involved, and we'll kind of go through some of those examples later. Before the meeting, teams should always begin the process of selecting in advance of the annual meeting by using and collecting data from a variety of sources, and then drafting some suggestions on the IEP. So we shouldn't be coming up with interesting ideas in the IEP meeting, because anything we're putting in an IEP should have some data source. So it's okay for IEP teams to discuss possible changes and say, we need to go back and collect some data to see if that would be appropriate, if they do not have that data. But a lot of times, and what is good to expect from IEP teams is they're coming up with proposed drafts based on data that's already collected. And then the team's kind of refining that. We always have to remember that data informs supplementary services. We want to have data informed supplementary services. So in the slides that we will be going through next, we've pulled a lot of information from PATN, which is the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, and they've had this up and running for many, many years and provides a lot of great resources. So I encourage you all to explore that website. And so they talk about the process for selecting aids and services. So remember, I talked about it being unique, individualized, data-based. So this is kind of reinforcing that. First of all, for selecting aids and services, you have to start with creating a profile of the learner. Then you're moving a little deeper. What's the profile of the classroom? And then looking at identification of barriers to learning or participating. And then identifying the supplementary aids or services to eliminate the barriers. So just like I was just kind of cautioning, you have to do these 3 boxes, these 3 steps of understanding and identifying barriers before you can make a selection of supplemental aids and services. So let's dig a little deeper into creating a learner profile. Some questions that might be asked is, what's the student's current status of accessing and participating in the general curriculum? How are they doing? What are the signs that they're being successful or not as successful as they need to be? What services and supports are working and have meaningful benefit, and then which ones are not? So just because an IEP has content in it, it doesn't mean that it needs to stay the same. It doesn't mean that the same supplementary aids and supports or accommodations or modifications would stay the same forever, because that continuous cycle of assessment is important to figure out what's working, what's not working, and what might be needed to change. So that you do that through having data-informed opinions and proposals. So let's talk about some guiding questions for existing supplementary aids and support. So that kind of study or analysis of what's going on, what's needed, what do we do next? We need to look at things like this. How often is the student using it? Can't be very effective if they're not using it very often. So it might be an appropriate strategy, but it's not being used consistently. How does the student feel about it? Do they understand it? Is there a difference in grades or anxiety level or on-task behavior with the services? How do staff members feel about the efficiency or effectiveness? Is there something else we know about that could be beneficial to the student? If so, you might want to consider that. And what input can the parent give about strategies that have worked at home? So this is all kind of part of the information gathering and selection process that leads you to better conclusions. So a reminder there, though, that present levels of achievement and academic performance should reflect the current use and effectiveness of these supplementary aids and services, and information about student preferences. As far as parent input, student interests and preferences need to be considered, and strategies that have worked in the past. So really having more of a multi-data source view to be able to look at different things from different perspectives and putting them in place. So as we go into the next step, creating a profile of the classroom, let's talk about that. Areas of consideration would be methods of learning in place, materials that are utilized in the classroom, physical characteristics, and then social demands. You know, what are the dynamics of the situation involving all these pieces? Where is this happening? What's the social culture of the classroom? What materials are involved, and what methods are used for learning? Is there a lot of visual support? Is there an instructor, talking? Is it independent work? Is it small group work? All those different kinds of features can be collected through direct observation or definitely teacher interview. And so the general ed teacher should have a major role in that process. So the headline of this slide is a little bit funny. Help, we don't know what classes a student will take. So if you're kind of doing some of these transition IEPs toward the end of the year, in one district, they call them bump ups. You have to consider the most common demands of the grade level or non-academic activities, and then use that as a guide. And then remember, the IEP team has to meet at a minimum annually, but as a new set of courses or instructors moves, even mid-year by semester, sometimes by marking period, it's okay to come back together and adjust those as you know more about the features of that classroom and that profile of the classroom. So some considerations: not all classrooms have the same methods, materials, physical environment, or social demands. So when I go into the Spanish class, it probably does look very different than the science lab, right? Just in extreme examples. The team will need to discuss where and when the student will need supplementary aids and services. And then, of course, like we mentioned earlier, we can't forget about non-academic activities. So those parts of the student's day with school peers that also might require some supplementary aids and services in order for them to access and participate. So then moving to identifying the barriers to learning or participating. What does the student's present level tell you about the student? What barriers for the student exist for each of the classroom demands? And considering what difficulties will the student experience without implementing supplementary aids and services? Well, for initial IEPs, initial eligibility considerations, we have some clues about that, because the student hasn't really received maybe as robust or specialized a program. But when students have had an ongoing IEP with appropriate supplementary aids and services, there's a little bit of, kind of postulating or suggestions about what difficulties would they experience without them. We're not testing them, cold turkey to see if it's working or not. We're really kind of projecting or guessing. Regardless, the focus must be on the student being able to meaningfully participate in activities or benefit from instruction. Okay. So now we're on identifying the supplementary aids or services to eliminate the barriers. So we're utilizing the strengths of the student to overcome these barriers. We're identifying those, and the selection should maximize participation and learning. That's what this is all about. Doing the things necessary because of the unique needs of the student to maximize their access to the general curriculum. Okay, so sometimes that affects their listening, their focus, or their independent work. And then, also just looking at actual devices, sort of an aid that can be put in place. So categories of support could be, as we mentioned before, adult support. It could be a person providing some sort of service. It could be instructional adaptations, like we've talked about with accommodations and modifications, or reformat, or, thinking about more vision related issues. How do you maximize a student's ability to see something? Well, what would you do? You might enlarge it. You might give them a magnification screen. You might put less on a page. Environmental supports. I think we kind of understand changing the environment, adding things or taking them away. Behavior supports, making sure that the expected behavior is clear. And then executive functioning supports really focus more on the organizing and clear expectations, and then the ability to kind of put the necessary supports in place to make the management part of education for the student, making sure their materials are accessible. We used to often do, something where there'd be an extra set of books. Well, now we've got electronic books, or it might be, the students always forgetting their charging cable. Most classrooms have an extra charging cable, but, some of those things very specific to the student might be needed because of organizational issues that they may have. So let's go a little deeper. Examples of adult support could be training that's provided. Sometimes, again, with kids who have vision or hearing issues, we have to go a little deeper with assistive technology or interpreters. Sometimes counseling could be an adult support. It could be that in certain settings within the day, a child needs a little bit more support from an adult. So a classroom assistant may go into a class or an environment with them to provide the just right amount of support, not to create dependency. Orientation and mobility is a service that's provided for students with vision issues. And then job coaching or behavior intervention as well. So some examples of instructional adaptations include using different presentation methods, different response methods, different types of materials, and then time and scheduling. So really looking at how is that instruction typically delivered and what adjustments need to be made so that the student can express their understanding, not just on the way the grade level material is typically developed, but their own way of responding. So with time and scheduling, I went over that a little bit quickly. Sometimes that is extra time on tests. That is things like, testing in a different environment, those sorts of things that we see typically. Then environmental supports could be referring to specific seating arrangements, preferential seating. And what I always ask is, what does preferential seating mean? Is that near the point of instruction? Is that in a quiet place in the classroom? Is it, what and for when? Is it in the cafeteria? Is it during math? Is it during reading? Is it only in the general classroom? Is it, it's only needed in the math class if it's high school? All those things have to be considered a little specifically and defined in the IEP. Then, of course, adaptive equipment. Adjustments made for sensory issues. So, that could be sound, it could be visual presentation, it could be texture, it could be lots of different things with sensory talking there. And then accessibility, just making sure that, a person can access through physical, visual means or communication means the environment. And then we've got adaptive equipment on here twice because it's super important. There are lots of different types of adaptive equipment from, things like wheelchairs or switches or eye gaze equipment, just anything that adapts the environment so a person can participate greater, that their individual condition isn't impacting that. We're getting a little bit of feedback. Someone might not be muted. Just a reminder. Social and behavioral supports. In that area, we're talking about counseling support for students and family, perhaps tiered support for the student to meet the expectations for behavior. Tiered support just meaning various levels of support, which could be, typical to slightly more individualized to a more individualized system of supports. Visual schedules that are used in lots of classrooms for kids that understand things a little bit better through visual means or learning verbal communication. Behavior contracts refers to those agreements that we set with kids. This is the goal. This is the payoff or the expectation. This is what you do to get there and meet that, kind of a written agreement. And that's, typically a first line kind of behavior situation to get the student to understand what the expectations are and get a team developed, right, between the teacher and the student. And then schedules of reinforcement. So looking at the correct reinforcers through reinforcement assessments, and then also implementing those with reinforcement at the correct schedules that are meaningful to that student. So if you have the right reinforcer, but the child can't access it enough, then sometimes that reinforcer isn't effective. Okay. So areas for potential support, we've kind of alluded to those things as we talked about all the different kinds of adaptations. Communication supports might be needed, academic supports might be needed, and then functional skills supports. Okay. So again, another source for a lot of information we're using today comes from the Kentucky Department of Education. and their materials on their IEP and lesson plan development handbook. So there are lots and lots of resources out there. They don't necessarily all come from South Carolina, but we have a great world of the web with lots of projects that have been funded through federal resources or innovative projects at the state level as well. We're pulling resources from. So let's talk about communication barriers and consideration of those. Just in the whole range of communication barriers, we tend to think about the ability to understand words, and that's kind of the listening comprehension portion, able to kind of take in information, think about it, and answer questions. Nonverbal, so some students do not speak primarily through verbal means. They can communicate through nonverbal means, like gestures or use of devices that provide communication support for them. And then, of course, kind of getting into the more typical areas of a speech language impairment, the expressive language, the ability to express themselves with words, and use appropriate language, and then voice, just the ability to use their voice to be heard. Sometimes children do have voice issues. Could be structural. And then fluency, just that ability to use words with speed and accuracy, and also being able to just communicate as they need to. And then pragmatics usually refers to that social use of language. So really being able to use kind of some social judgment, some social codes, social norms that we've developed in conversation, and all those sorts of things. And then articulation, of course, I think most people understand that's when you're having difficulty articulating sounds. So there may be a lot of sound errors. Thinking of that much like younger children developmentally have articulation errors, but sometimes those articulation errors will stay over time and need specific assistance. In academics, common areas we think about are, just those basic reading, decoding skills, understanding of the written words, reading comprehension. Then written language is just that ability to express yourself in words in the written form. And then math calculation and math reasoning. So completing those operational problems, and then also using your math vocabulary, those math words and knowledge of operations to reason through and solve problems. Sometimes it's called math problem solving as well. In the functional skill area, when we talk about that, we're thinking about daily living skills or adaptive skills, kind of self-help. If some of you are familiar with our tools that we use for that, kind of thinking about, for instance, a Vineland adaptive behavior scale has domains of daily living skills, that kind of self-help area, socialization. So how are we, cooperating and working with others, communication, and some motor, all of that kind of gets intertwined in that functional skill area, because it requires attention and some organization and some self-regulation, and also the ability to execute by following directions, which requires short-term memory, holding it in your memory just long enough to be able to make sense of it and produce a response. Okay, so let me go back. A reminder before we select new accommodations, before adding them to the IEP, it's a good idea to assess for effectiveness. So again, it's not best practice to be sitting at a meeting and say, hey, what do you think? Do we need to offer this accommodation? It should be, I've observed, I've seen, the general ed teacher can provide some information about the student's utilization of an accommodation, and then data should be collected. Determining if the accommodation is effective for the problem at hand that you're trying to address. If there's a barrier, is that accommodation the most effective accommodation to remove the barrier? And then how consistently or how efficiently can the accommodation be implemented according to staff? So if it's in the IEP, the expectation is that it's done consistently based on the conditions under which it's written. So if it says every time a test is given in English language arts class, a copy of the teacher's notes will be provided the night before for review, or, is that going to be specific and followed? So those sorts of things have to be considered. And then what's the student's response to the accommodation? So if the IEP says we're going to do this thing, and then the student completely rejects it, it can't be implemented, right? So the IEP team would need to come back together and reassess that, and also do some student training. Why are you getting this accommodation? What does this mean? Why don't you like it? And we often do small group or separate testing, and some kids don't like to be removed. Sometimes they would be better if they could sit in a quiet area in the classroom or have headphones on to be able to focus better. So taking the student's perspective into light is really important. So kind of going through a worksheet format, we've talked about a variety of these things already. We have to look at these guiding questions. What are the learning and functional strengths? What does the student currently access with success? What instructional methods are used? What materials? What are the physical and social demands? And then what are the barriers to learning? What currently is the student using that are not enabling them to participate and learn that need to be removed? Again, we might be adding, we might be removing based on data. And then those last sections of that we just talked about, the possible supplementary aids and services. How effective will they be? How will the student respond to them? And then can they be implemented efficiently and effectively? So worksheet format like this is helpful just as a problem solving tool to make sure all those guiding questions are considered, and it really guides you, guides you through an appropriate response, appropriate selection. If we haven't said it once, we said it twice or 3 times to 4 times, that data should help the teams to select just a few highly efficient and effective supplementary aids and services to enable students to participate in their school activities, whether they're academic or non-academic. So the goal isn't to load up, there's no menu. It's which things are most effective with the least amount of change, right? That least restrictive environment kind of goes to the least amount of changes or supplementary aids to meet the needs. So high intensity, efficient is what works. So once you've selected them, wait, we're not finished. Don't dismay. You have to ask, what will it take to implement? So once supplementary aids and services have been selected, the team will need to determine the needs for implementation. So of course, we believe training is important. You have to kind of look at all the training needs for the individual and the best way to train them, and consider what materials might be necessary and make sure it gets done. So you have to consider who needs training, who will provide the training, what needs to be trained, when and how often, and then what are the contingency plans if something isn't working or someone can't deliver training. We try not to be staff dependent in our planning because we're all just filling roles. So you should usually be more than one person who can make sure something gets done as well. So you have to consider these parties here, the students, the families, and the staff as far as training needs. So let's talk about assistive technology consideration. So what is needed to utilize assistive technology? Who's responsible for getting and setting it up, and who will monitor to ensure technology is working? Those are all questions that have to be answered. It's not a game of not it. There should be definitely a method and a plan in place for people for assistive technology to be used. So there should be some material considerations. Are there materials that will be needed to be acquired? And those could be, associated with Braille. If the school district hasn't had a student using Braille before, there's some equipment involved with that and a lot of preparation. Large print things might need to be ordered, or adjustments might be made to readability. Who will be responsible for getting needed materials for implementation, and then who will maintain those materials? Because again, once it's the plan, we have to follow it. For personnel, consideration should be made for what staff will be needed to implement the supplementary aids and services. If it's a direct service, when and where will it be delivered? How will it be documented? And then how will the service delivery provider communicate and collaborate with staff and families? Because it should never be that closed system where it's written down and everyone's just assuming it's getting done. It should be, a continuous feedback system or continuous assessment of what's needed, what's going well, what else needs to be done, what needs to be changed. Okay. Within the Enrich program, this is a screenshot. There's an arrow going to this bottom section here that's entitled specific instruction to accommodations or modifications. So we want to make sure the specific instruction is well written. So the person who is not in the meeting would know what the supplementary aids and services are and what must be implemented, how must they be implemented. So it needs to kind of, for a person who doesn't know what's going on, what's going to be done. So that language needs to be focused on a little bit in the meeting, and that's a team effort sometimes. One tool suggestion for implementation is this IEP action plan for follow-up. So kind of listing out again on a simple worksheet, what's the action, who's responsible, and when is it going to get done? A lot of us who have a lot of different parts to our jobs find checklists and worksheets helpful, just so we know what our assignments are and what our expectations are. So it's a good idea to have that conversation and do some planning and make sure that somebody, usually the case manager, the case lead, or the team lead for the IEP services is looking carefully to make sure those things get done. So documentation. Team members should have a plan for how they document that these things that have been decided upon are implemented. And the documentation, for it to get done, we know things should be as easy and efficient as possible for team members, right? So if it's tedious, it's less likely to get done. If you can get something done with the least amount of effort, that's the right thing behaviorally to do, even for adults, is how do you achieve the goal with the least amount of effort. Considerations for documentation should be made because this data provides information for our next development of the present levels of performance in the IEP, that PLAF section. It should reflect, we've been implementing these things, these are effective, we think we need to change this. That all is in that kind of present levels. So assessing how is it being used, the students' perceptions, and how it worked out should all be in there. A final reminder, inclusion is right for all children and is about meaningful participation and equal access. That's how we started this out today. How to get these barriers removed, right? Supplementary aids and services are key to participation and equal access. So let's next talk a little bit about some of the resources that Family Connection also provides. All of these items are available through Family Connection. And so the slide will be available. There's early transitions material, children's journeys workbooks, and a variety of tip sheets. And we'll next go through the chat, see if we have any chat questions, and complete an exit poll. But we want to make sure at Family Connection you're also aware that we know that special education can be a complicated process, but Family Connection is here to help. So if you have any questions, keep this number handy, program it into your phone. You can always call and someone will be able to reach you and address your specific questions. So let's go to our chat and look real quickly and see. I don't see any questions so far in the chat. Does anybody have a burning question about what we've discussed you'd like to put in the chat now? I'll wait a moment. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. That's okay. It must be understandable information for you all. A real advanced class for sure. Let's go ahead and launch that exit poll. We've done the pre-training poll. Now let's do our post-training poll. And We have about 10 of you here right now, so I'll be looking for your participation on our 5 questions, then we'll review them together, and then if there are additional questions, you can put those in the chat. All right, I'll give you a few minutes. Looks like we've got about 6 of 11 people who participated. We'll give it another minute or 2. And then we'll go through those responses. Like you've done pretty well. Okay, I think we've got almost everybody. Almost everybody here and answered. Let's kind of go through those. Let me see. If I end the poll, I can share the results. Okay, you should be able to see them. So for number 1, the answer was false. Special ed teachers are responsible for selecting all the supplementary aids and services for implementation. Yet you got that one correct, false. Number 2, supplementary aids and services should be considered before we consider the removal of a child to a more restrictive special education environment. Yep, that's true. Training for staff, students, and families is essential for the effective use. 100% of you, true, excellent. And then 4, students will need the same supplementary aids and services for every academic year. Nope, false, got it. And then supplementary aids and services are only for academic areas. And we said false, 100%. Good. You all did great on those. I appreciate you paying such great attention today. As we kind of wrap up for the day, again, I just want you to remember this contact information is available if you have additional questions after you review their training materials, after you think about the things today, or if you have any other questions for Family Connection. You've got the phone number here and the website. And I'll just give you all another moment to look at chat. Looks like I've got one in here. It says, sometimes I get confused by the definition of supplementary aids and services because at times it appears that what we write is duplicated or triplicated throughout the IEP in various sections. So that's really true. It isn't so much that you want to see only one thing in one part of the IEP. Really, as teachers go through training, they're taught that if they put something in that present levels of academic strengths and needs section, that PLAF section, functional performance, all of that goes in there, that it should trace into different parts of the IEP. So there shouldn't be an identified need in that PLAF in that first section of the IEP that doesn't translate elsewhere. So you could see the mention of supplementary aids and services, accommodations, modifications, all that in that PLAF. And then you're going to see it in the other sections of the IEP where those specific things that must be done are explained in greater detail. So there's a section, it'll say, what are the accommodations or modifications? And then below it, it'll say, and how can these be implemented? And then that's when it's kind of operationalized a little bit more. So you're right, it is all over the IEP. And, you know, sometimes school districts, you know, decide they want to be very, very comprehensive, and sometimes they put things in places they might not need to, but they kind of overdo it a little bit, but it doesn't make it necessarily wrong. You can always do a little bit more. It's just that the minimum requirements are met is really essential. So how do we access the presentation and the resources provided? So after you get the, after we finish today, I believe Ms. Wingard sends out a thank you for participating email and directs you to where you can get the slides, and there are some supportive handouts and all those things. And then the video will be posted on the website. It isn't done instantly because there's a little editing that sometimes has to be done at the front or tail end. But that will be available to you all. And again, if you for some reason don't get it, but you definitely are registered, just go back to that that contact information and email. Okay. Does a child's IEP follow them to a virtual public charter school? I'm specifically referring to a ParaPro, which he currently has in a virtual program. So if the virtual public charter school is part of the school district, the virtual or the public charter school district, and the IEP is moving, if an IEP is moving, if a student has an IEP and they're served in a public school in South Carolina, let me say it that way, then the IEP will transfer, and the school district has to do a statement of upon transfer about the comparable services. So the school district is obligated basically to implement the current IEP as closely as possible until they can have an IEP meeting based on their data and look at needs in those settings. So in short, if you have an IEP in one school and move to another public school in South Carolina, the IEP should transfer. Okay. Those are questions to ask the special education director if you have concerns as you move from one district to another. Just a little follow-up on what we were talking about the sections all over the IEP, talking about supplementary aids and services. I understand that, but unfortunately some teachers just read the modification sections. I was bemused when a teacher told me that. Okay, so, you know, sometimes there are some training needs for sure. And I think it's sort of personal habit. Sometimes if we do things a lot, we start taking some little shortcuts. So having a discussion and asking questions about any and all sections of the IEP is always appropriate rather than just reading through it. Okay. And then we had a thank you. Are there any other questions that I've missed or that we need? I don't think I've missed any chat. I think I've handled everything. Just want to make sure. Oh, look like we've got one more. Oh, as the case manager, I had no idea how to respond. Ask questions. Whenever you think a part of the IEP isn't going right, ask some questions. Can we talk about that a little bit more? Can you explain the modifications a little bit more? Where will that be, you know, implemented? All those kind of guiding questions we went over are good resources, but just ask. Try to generate a conversation if something seems kind of like flat or just kind of stated. It's always good to say, now I was thinking about modifications. Can you tell me a little bit more about those? Just having that kind of interviewing skill that I know case managers are good at, that could help to kind of stimulate conversation. Okay. All right. So I think we are going to close it down for today. Thank you all so much for being part of our training here with Family Connection. We hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.